In this lesson, I'm going to introduce some terminology for different forms of transport. Then we'll have a look at some simple sentences to say you go by a particular transport or you go to a particular place by a particular transport. Let's start with some basic words for transport. Den, sha. Den meaning electricity, sha meaning a vehicle, electrical vehicle. Den, sha. These days we've got electrical cars as well, but originally the trains were the first electrical vehicles. Den, sha. Train. Takushi. Takushi. Obviously from the English word taxi. Interesting thing about Japanese taxis is the driver has a lever to open and close the doors. So never feel pressured to open or close the doors in the taxis in Japan. Of course, it does cause a problem for Japanese who travel overseas when the other taxis in other countries don't have a similar way of opening and closing the doors, and often they'll leave a taxi, walk away, forgetting to close the doors, thinking that the driver has control. Takushi, taxi. Shinkansen. Shinkansen literally means new trunk line, but it's what we call the bullet train in Japanese. Shinkansen, bullet train. Hikouki. Hikouki, aeroplane. Hikouki. Otobai. Otobai. The Japanese word for a motorbike. It actually comes from the original German. So we don't have motor on the front, we have auto from auto. Otobai. Kuruma. Car. Kuruma. Basu. Basu obviously comes from the English word for bus as well, and that is why it's written in katakana. Basu, very easy to remember, the Japanese word for basu. Jitensha. Jitensha is a bicycle. Ji meaning self, because you have to propel it yourself. The sha on the end, just like densha, is the sha, meaning vehicle. Jitensha. Let's review those words very quickly. Densha, takushi, shinkansen, hikouki, meaning aeroplane, otobai, kuruma, basu, jitensha. So these are the most typical transport. Obviously there are other forms of transport you will find in Japan and in other parts of the world. But let's practice with these, and then later on, if you learn other expressions, you can add them into our basic sentence structures. The first sentence structure we'll look at is just saying I go by train or I go by taxi, because it's a common expression. The first thing we say is the vehicle, then we follow with de, meaning by, and ikimasu, the verb to go. So, for example, densha de ikimasu would literally mean I go by train. Densha de ikimasu. We could also say, if we were going somewhere by taxi, we would simply put the word for taxi in the first space and say, takushi de ikimasu. Takushi de ikimasu. I go by taxi. Ikimasu can also give us the feeling of a future. I will go by taxi. Takushi de ikimasu. I will go by taxi. Of course, if we were going to take the bullet train and somebody's asked us, how are you going to get to Tokyo, or how are you going to get to another place, you would say, Shinkansen de ikimasu. Shinkansen de ikimasu. I will go by bullet train, or I go by bullet train, if you do it on a regular basis as well. So in the same way, hikoki de ikimasu. I go by plane. Otobai de ikimasu. I go by motorbike. Kuruma de ikimasu. I go by car. Basu de ikimasu. I go by bus. And jitensha de ikimasu. I go by bicycle. If we wanted to add the place we're going to, we simply put that after the de, which tells us we're going by a particular transport. Then we have the place, which is followed by ni, meaning to the place, and the verb ikimasu. Obviously, we could say kaerimasu if we're returning there, or kimasu if we're coming. But in this case, we're simply making the sentence, I go by a particular transport to a particular place. An example might be, if you drive or if you are driven and you go by car to school, you would say kuruma for the car, kuruma de by car, gakko for the school, gakko ni ikimasu. I go by car to school. Kuruma de gakko ni ikimasu. Another example might be Shinkansen de by bullet train, Tokyo ni ikimasu. I'm going to Tokyo by bullet train. Shinkansen de Tokyo ni ikimasu. Or if we were talking about travelling to Japan, it would be most likely we'd go by hikoki. Hikoki de Nihon ni ikimasu. I go by plane to Japan. Hikoki de Nihon ni ikimasu.